Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first conference. I'm James from London Funders, and it's great to see you all here today. You're part of a group of over 200 people who are joining us over the next 3 days to look at the past, the present, and the future of funding for a London civil society. We hope you'll also join us in the conversation online with people who can't join us on our Zoom screens this morning. If you're on Twitter, just join the conversation using the hashtag Campference20. Shortly, I'm going to hand over to our fantastic chair for today's session, Mr. John Griffiths. But as people are arriving into the room today, we just wanted to do a quick poll to find out who's in the room and what you've learned yourselves over the last 6 months. So I'm going to launch a poll that will appear on your screens now. And we're just asking 3 questions for you here. Firstly, what kind of organisation do you represent? London Funders, as you know, is a cross-sector network of funders bringing together 170 different organisations from the public, private and independent sectors. We're really keen to hear from you which organisation you represent so we can get a sense of what sectors are represented here today. Our second question asks you about how your organisation's work shifted at the start of the pandemic. We know people took a lot of different approaches to how we worked. Some people paused taking applications while they looked at what was going to change over the coming months. Some people put more money out to their grantees. Some people pivoted or partnered with us and looked at the London community response and other opportunities to increase the effectiveness of grant making at this time. And the third question we're keen to hear from you on this morning is about what learning you're taking from the last 6 months yourselves that you think we need to hold on to for the future. Be that about working more collaboratively with others, about tackling injustice and inequality in society, or issues about trust, relationships, data and flexibility. Whatever you've done over the last 6 months that you think we should hold on to for the future, that's your place to pop that in the answers there. We'll keep this poll open for another minute and let you give the opportunity to tell us who you are, where you're from, and what organisations approaches you took during the pandemic. And then I'll be handing over to our panel chair. So just another 30 seconds for you to vote in that online poll. And remember, keep the conversation going online once you voted using the hashtag Campference20. So just another 15 seconds of voting there. Reminder, we're asking you what kind of organisation you represent so we get a sense of which sectors are here in the room today. Asking you about what words best describes your organisation's approach to how you did your grants during the pandemic. And then thirdly, what learning you're taking from the last 6 months that we need to hold on to for the future. I should point out as well, these are multiple choice questions, but you can also tick more than one option if you took different approaches as well. So I'm going to end the polling there and share the results with you. So we have a good representation of different membership here today. Just about a quarter of you from the public sector, be they local authority or regional government. About half of you from our independent trust or foundation members. Just under 10% from organisations that fundraise as well as give grants, including the lotteries. We've also got a housing association and corporate members represented today. And in our other category, we know there are members here today who do fundraising, grant giving, and deliver direct activities within civil society as well. In terms of how organisations shifted their work at the start of the pandemic, really good to see that over half of you in the room here today were part of the partnership that came behind the London community response, but also quite a spread across the different answers as well. We're going to keep looking at these questions over the coming months and try and pull together a sense of how civil society responded and how funders responded through the learning work we're doing as part of the London community response, and also the partnership we have with IVAR to look at funder approaches generally. So all this data will also be shared as part of those processes. And then in terms of what learning you're hoping to hold on to from the last 6 months to shape our work for the future, really importantly for us, the biggest answer there is collaboration. That of course is one of the main functions of London Funders, to bring funders together to enable you to cooperate effectively to better meet the needs of London civil society. So really important to see collaboration is still going to be at the heart of our responses, but also strong messages there about justice and listening to the voice of our communities. They're all themes that we think are going to be important for the future. We think they're also themes that are going to be important for the discussion that we're going to have this morning. So I'm going to go off camera now and hand over to John Griffiths and our fantastic panel. We hope you enjoy the discussion today.
James, thank you very much and welcome everybody to the first of London Funders Ever conferences. As James said, this is the first of 3 sessions over 3 days, and it might not be Christmas just yet, but I was thinking this morning we might want to just put ourselves in the shoes of an Ebenezer Scrooge over the next 3 days, an opportunity to reflect on the past, the present and the future, and how life might change for the better. So today we're looking backwards, we're taking stock, and as was famously said, those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And as those of you who know me, I studied history a long time ago, and I've always had a great belief in the relevance of history and the relevance of the past to making good decisions and informing the present. Before I hand over to our speakers, just want to say a couple of things. Over the past couple of weeks, we saw the production and response to quite a significant report, I think, that was commissioned by the Prime Minister from one of his MPs, Danny Kruger. Danny, you may well know, before he became an MP in December last year, formerly was a chief advisor to the PM and was instrumental in writing the civil society strategy. I'd like to quote from the report he presented to the Prime Minister, because I think it gives an idea of the sense of importance, the cusp of the moment we're at the moment. He talked about being on the cusp of a new era of economic and social policy. The era just ending was governed by economic and social doctrines which have caused us to become the most regionally unequal country in the developed world, with a range of chronic social challenges. He went on to say, a wholly new paradigm is possible in which community power replaces the dominance of remote public and private sector bureaucracies. Now, coming from a backbench Conservative MP, but an influential one, I think that's a very significant statement. Speakers this morning will be sharing their own initial reflections on and reactions to the crisis we've been experiencing, how they've approached organisational change, and giving us their personal reflections about how the response of the sector and communities can inform our next steps and hopefully a more optimistic future. As you listen to the speakers, and I'll hand over now to our first speaker in a minute, I'd like you just to think about one thing as you listen to the speakers. From what you listen to, if you were given the chance to reject something that we used to do and resign that to the dustbin of history, what would that be? Equally, what would you restore? Something that we've lost over the last 6 months that we might need to go back to? And equally, what have we done over the last 6 months that we'd like to retain going forward? Something new which is worth keeping and building on. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Kim Smith, Chief Executive of the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. Kim has got a very distinguished and long career in local government, and also has a strong affinity with the community and social sector. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Kim to take the floor. Thank you, Kim.
Good morning, can you hear me? Michelle, just open the door for me, please. No.
Kim, I think you're on mute.
I can start if you like, John, and we can come back to Kim.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me and can you see me?
Yes,
Can
we
hear
can,
you.
Kim. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Phew, phew. So good morning, everybody. There's always the one. I'm Kim Smith, and I'm the Chief Executive at Hammersmith and Fulham, and I'm the person who can't use Zoom. So bear with me. I'm only going to speak for a little while, and fingers crossed I can get through it without any interruptions. Not only is my Zoom not working, but I feel kind of honoured to be amongst the presence of so many funders. Years and years ago, when I started as a youth and community worker in the voluntary sector, to be in the presence of 100 and odd plus 170 odd funders, London funders, I would have given all that I had to be able to address a group of funders about what was working well and what wasn't working well in the voluntary sector. So I walk amongst giants today, and well done to all of you, to John and to James for organising what will be a fantastic CAM conference. So I'm just going to talk very quickly about perhaps a local government perspective and perhaps my own perspective of the last 6 months. We started 6 months ago talking about the coronavirus, then we talked about COVID-19, and now it's just COVID. So I've got 2 slides for you, and let me see if I can get through them. If somebody could help me with the first slide. So I can see 24 things I know now about COVID that I wish I knew then. And you'll be very pleased to see some onions in that image there. It's a random picture, probably something to do with smell around COVID, but I just wanted to get your attention. And I'm not going to talk about 24 things. I wanted to get your attention too. So let me see what I'm going to talk about. And I think that there are 4 of them, and that's on the next slide. Please. So I can just see on here, I'm going to talk you through 4 areas over the last 6 months, 7, 8 months. I can't even remember now. I feel so weary in responding to COVID when it all started. But in the very beginning, I think that there was a very clear and important learning and around getting the basics right. In Hammersmith and Fulham, we swiftly went into emergency planning mode. I appointed a director as the COVID response director. We started collaborating with Imperial University in order to try and develop some collaborations. And we collaborated with the mutual aid groups in our borough, a community aid network, in order to develop some new partnerships. So the most important thing I think I learned in the last 6 months was jump in the water quickly, because the time that it takes to plan and to think things through when it's an emergency, we need to act quickly. And I suppose my biggest reflection on COVID is that I've been trained over time to deal with shocks, whether they be fire, water, flood, different emergencies. Civic planning and emergency response across London is absolutely fantastic. But this is less about shock, this is more about stress. And stress is something that continues over time. And the other difference with COVID is it was impacting on us all and our loved ones, as well as our ability to do the jobs that we do in paid and unpaid capacities. So getting the basics right, I think, has been really critical. What can we learn from getting ready and G'd up to do something like this again? It's really about pace and speed, matrix working, some of the rules going out the window. How could we work differently? In local government, we stopped providing a lot of services and we concentrated on the key critical services. I think there's a lot we can learn from that, because it really allowed us to stop some of the business as usual and concentrate on saving lives. It's a conference about funding voluntary and community sector particularly, so I would say thank you and well done to the people power, to the communities and to the community organisers. What's interesting and different about what I saw in COVID and the way forward is that it was less about the big established voluntary and community sector. Don't know if I'll make myself popular by saying that, but what I saw was lots of influencers, lots of social media. We have Nextdoor in my borough, but lots of very community, very small, locally led, on the street, community clapping and followership, less about leadership, but more about followership in communities. And I think that there's something for us all in the large and often bureaucratic ways in which we respond, and the way in which during COVID, people just organically did things. How do we harness that? How do we work with that? And how do we follow that rather than trying to lead it? I think is really important. Love your hood, that's love the neighbourhood. All of a sudden we started walking and cycling and shopping locally and getting out and about in our communities. And the idea of neighbourliness and knowing your neighbours has been so important. How do we, as a community, as a London community, make sure that that's sustainable? How does that resilience become something that goes with us into the future rather than it was a one-off? The idea of the community clap for the NHS and key workers. How do we make sure that we continue to keep an eye on each other? And the role of the voluntary and community sector is really fundamental in all of that. So I applaud each and every organisation that established organically or was already in place to do deliveries on food banks and other ways in which the shielded community got lots of support. I saw great examples of that in my borough. And I think that that's something that this conference, this CAMference, can build on. How do we make sure that those hyper-local community initiatives, what's relevant to people in streets and neighbourhoods, doesn't get lost in the big pan-London picture? And then I suppose my fourth biggest observation over the last 6 months, and my biggest learning, is that some people say don't waste a good crisis. And I wouldn't say that because of the loss of life and the seriousness of this pandemic. But what I would say is that there's been some utterly amazing new normals, some new collaborations, new ways of working, and some new ideas that we're now able to talk about that we didn't talk about before. So in terms of my local authority's response to the climate emergency, my printing, my photocopying bill has been cut down to by 90%. And that's significant because of the fact that 1,700 people are now working from home out of a workforce just over 2,000 people. So we've been able to do something really, really major because through COVID, through the coronavirus. And I would say Black Lives Matter, we're now talking about disproportionate impacts and race inequality in a way that we didn't dare speak about before. And I really welcome that. And through COVID, it's allowed us now to get to the heart of the problem or the issue and to talk about targeted interventions. And I think that that's a huge opportunity that I would urge funders and colleagues to think about. How do we take it forward? I've put digital inclusion. Not only have we learnt new ways of working through Teams and Zoom and doing stuff virtually, cutting meetings down, I've also, for me personally, seen how my workforce at Hammersmith and Fulham Council have really benefited from cutting down on the commute and cutting down on spending time in and out of meetings, being able to do that online and from home. How do we make sure the tech and the digital facilities that we've got are passed on beyond large organisations and established organisations to individuals? How do we make sure that people who are facing isolation and loneliness are able to use smartphones and other digital kit in order to make their lives better, from online shopping to talking and befriending? So those are the four areas where I think, in terms of my lessons, there's a lot more that I could say, but I hope that that's a bit of a starter for a conversation. In summary, much I've learned in the last 6 months has been about partnerships and collaboration, doing things swiftly. I've also learned a lot about hyperlocal. How do we get back to basics by doing things that matter in small communities as well as on the big stage? And as I said, don't waste a crisis, because some really remarkable conversations and activities and endeavours have come out of COVID-19. Last thing for me to say, I put the light bulb on there, not to celebrate Thomas Edison, because he did an amazing job, but the carbon filament was invented by Lewis Latimer in 1881. It is Black History Month, and I just wanted to end with something very positive. Thank you for listening to me.
Kim, many thanks for that. That was a terrific introduction to the session. I'm going to move us swiftly on because time is pressing. Our next speaker is Rosie Ferguson, who's Chief Executive of the House of St Barnabas. Rosie's got huge experience across the sector and is currently chair of Akivo. So look forward to hearing Rosie's views.
Thanks, John. And as you say, I'm sharing first from the perspective of House of St Barnabas and then a bit from Akivo. I am usually a real optimist, and I have to say I found it challenging thinking about what to say here to make sure that I brought some optimism, but I'll do my best. So first, as Chief Executive of House of St Barnabas, we're a social enterprise members club supporting people who've experienced homelessness to secure good work, a good home and a supportive network. And we've been hit by the kind of double whammy of working in the hospitality sector and supporting people who've experienced homelessness, both of which have been kind of urgent and critical over the last however many months. Our approach initially back in March was to stop working with new participants and to prioritise those we'd worked with in the past, most of whom were people who'd experienced homelessness, had then progressed into careers in the hospitality sector and found themselves in extremely precarious circumstances. We focus mainly on their mental and financial well-being through lockdown, and there were three trends that really hindered our ability to do what we were trying to do. The first was a significant retreat of essential services. About getting GP appointments, housing and benefit appointments, access to food banks for people who didn't have a permanent address, all of those essential services were really more challenging than normal to rely on. Also, the digital divide, which has already been touched on, digital became the only way of accessing services. And although in theory, a lot of government services are mobile optimized, that really didn't turn out to be the reality for people. If you didn't have a laptop and you couldn't access a library where so many people go for their connectivity, or an internet cafe with free Wi-Fi, people were absolutely shut out of not just essential services, but also interactions with their family, their social life, everything that enables people to be a participant. You were essentially a kind of non-person if you didn't have that digital access. And then, as we all know, lower earners disproportionately affected by redundancies, playing out in terms of not just people losing their jobs, but also in furloughing, in reduced hours, the 80% reduction. Half of those who we were supporting at the beginning of crisis who were in work are now either made redundant or currently at risk of redundancy. So 50% of people we'd supported into hospitality jobs no longer have those jobs. Despite that, I'm determined to have some hope. We did see some really good employer practice. So the Wolsey and Piccadilly stayed in regular contact with staff throughout, and they were really supportive, offering advice and support. And Helen, one of our graduates, is now back serving as the first female door person on Piccadilly. So there were examples of organisations who did go above and beyond. And I think as we go into the winter, it's really important to think about how do we celebrate and recognise those employers who have really stepped up. We're now very much open and delivering face-to-face programmes and support, as well as repositioning ourselves as a workplace for members. We are forecasting a 40% reduction in income this year, as many charities are. But for us, it isn't an option to close our doors and retreat into our homes. We have very strict COVID secure practice, but we are there every day. All of our staff are in, we're running an education facility and a hospitality business, and we feel there is still choice. We feel that the risk of neglecting our participants in hostels and unsuitable living conditions is greater than the risks of operating in the house at the moment, because we're really strict and we're able to operate within those guidelines. If you'll excuse me, a quick plug, we are open at the House for new members and we are a workspace. So if you're desperate to get away from working from home, we have lovely lunch and great space where you can connect with colleagues within the guidelines. As we look to the future, I think it's critical that we see that retreating into the comfort of our own homes and neglecting the most vulnerable is a choice by policymakers and businesses and civil society leaders. It is not an inevitable byproduct of the pandemic. We can do better in this second wave. We cannot just, I mean, you've probably heard that recent joke, middle class people sat at home in their gardens while working class people brought them things. I do not want people to say that of this second wave. Now, that doesn't mean we all have to go out and breach the guidelines, but we really think about how we shift that dynamic. As chair of Akivo, the Network for Civil Society Leaders, I've had a more kind of bird's eye view lens beyond the four walls of the House of St Barnabas. We've seen high membership retention rates as the demand from CEOs for support and connection has skyrocketed. We've shifted from providing kind of 2 or 3 face-to-face events a week to 2 or 3 events a day online. And again, I'm going to start with a few positive trends that Akivo has seen across the sector. Governance has stepped up. So our sector is often characterised by clunky, risk-averse trustee boards who are kind of soaking up administrative capacity and blocking innovation. But actually, many CEOs report that that has not been the reality. There has been quick, responsive decision-making. Trustees overall have been really focused on beneficiary need and much more willing to take risks. Of course, that's not the case in all situations, and where it hasn't been, the relationships between CEOs and chairs have become under increasing pressure. But I think that has provided an exciting blueprint for the future in terms of how governance can be more responsive. Innovation has been fast forwarded, so much needed change projects around digital and inclusion that would have taken years and cost thousands of pounds were kind of accelerated overnight as charities put their services online and confronted some of the racism in their own organisations as the Black Lives Matter movement took the spotlight. And thankfully, trusts and foundations yourselves kind of understood and responded. So many of you in the room stepped up. The London Community Response Fund was a really quick and focused collaboration that just understood exactly what the sector needed in that moment. So thank you for that. However, sadly, these positives are dwarfed by some negatives. I won't go into the detail. The impact on the vulnerable, and everybody in this room knows the disproportionate impact on COVID-19 of both the restrictions and the economy on the poor and the sick and those prone to poor mental health. The scale of the redundancies, many charities losing up to or more than a third of their workforce, which is not only sad for those individuals affected, but it also means that the well-being and the workload for those people that are left behind who are trying to deliver the same, if not more, as need among their beneficiaries has increased. And thirdly, the gulf in the charity finances, and particularly those who are mostly dependent on earned income. I think some charities who've been mainly trusts and foundations dependent have actually found themselves ahead of where they would be at this point of the year because they've been able to access additional resources that trusts and foundations have put out there. But people who have kind of followed the trends of shifting to commercial income have been really punished for that. So I think that's something to think about as we move forward. I feel like we've been talking for years in the sector about the increasing need in the context of diminishing resources, but those previous conversations have now been dwarfed in the context of what we're facing now. So finally, from me, as we enter a second wave, I think it's how do we, if our response to the first wave was to retreat into our houses and to work out what we could do and try to recalibrate in this new world, what do we want to characterize our response in this second wave to be? And how do we make sure it isn't middle-class people sitting at home while the poor take the burden of the pandemic?
Rosie, thank you very much for that. It was fascinating having those twin perspectives from frontline services and with your Akivo hat on the importance of an infrastructure organisation as well. That's really fascinating. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on and invite our third speaker, Yvonne Field from Ubailey, to take the mic. Yvonne has more than 35 years experience working in the social enterprise sector and will bring her perspective to this question now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. Just thanks very much for this opportunity to reflect on the journey that we've been on for the last 6 months. It's really weird. Well, a number of weird things have happened during the pandemic, but one of them, and probably the most surprising one, is that as an organisation, Borough, which is 6 years old, we started off with basically actually almost no funding from funders in the UK. And ended up becoming a funding expert in 6 months. So I don't quite know how that's happened, but here I am this morning. So I hope what I've got to say is of interest. Just want to say something about the wider context of our organisation. As I said, we're 6 years old, we're Black-led, we're a social enterprise. The concept came about 10 years ago when we were thinking about the sustainability of Black communities in the UK. basically, plan A to go home to the Caribbean and Africa, which our parents held when they migrated here in the Windrush era, didn't work. We're now third or fourth generation. So we thought we better think about our longer term sustainability in the UK. We're a local, regional, national and international organisation, which is a little bit unusual. I was told 5 years ago when this was a vision for Ubele that Black-led groups do not actually span the different spaces in the sector and across the country. And I just said, well, we do and we will. Last December, we had one full-time member of staff and a team of 15 associates working on projects. We had no core funding, project-based only. And then we got a large Erasmus European grant, which we subsequently couldn't put into place because COVID happened in March. So that left us having to furlough staff and scrabble around. But also at the beginning of this year, February, we were appointed as the BAME infrastructure group for London with the GLA. And therefore that gave us an opportunity to start responding to COVID when it really kicked in March. So it was just in time, because up until then, there wasn't actually a BAME infrastructure group that had funding in London. That was the situation for about 10 years. I'd sort of say that as wider context as to who we are and how we ended up doing what we've been doing for the last 6 months. However, the team that I work with, we've got between us over 200 years experience of working in communities in the UK. The core team are we're an intergenerational organisation, but the core team that set us up, probably average age, late 40s into 50s. So what did we do in terms of initial reactions to COVID? Actually, we had a really early heads up that this virus was impacting disproportionately on Black and minority ethnic communities. We heard in March that 70% of the men 70% of the patients in King's were Black men under the age of 65. We heard that early March. And also I and 4 members of my family got COVID ourselves in March and April. We decided, because of the funding that we got from the GLA with being the BAME infrastructure group, we decided we couldn't do the original project because it wasn't appropriate given COVID, but we pivoted and repurposed the grant to some activities, including the piece of research that we had no idea would become quite a foundational piece of research in terms of how COVID was impacting on Black and minority ethnic communities, which we found 9 out of 10 groups we're going to close, if not invested in. We're now just completing a follow-up piece of work research, but that led to the establishment of the Phoenix Fund, which was £1 million of lottery money that we've been using participatory grant making with 12 regional representatives from across the country from Black and minority ethnic infrastructure groups and anchor organisations to actually design. In the moment, actually, sometimes we design things and change things as we go along when it's not working. So it's a bit more than participatory. In April and May, 2 things happened. One, charity So White wrote their piece, which also was a slam dunk, I think, in terms of the funding sector and across the country. And we collaborated with them and mobilised and campaigned. I also wrote an article called Not Waving, I'm Drowning. And that was really me saying, look, we've had at least 10, if not 15 years underinvestment in the Black and minority sector. And now that COVID's hit, we're falling apart basically. And, and drowning. And that we as Ubele was in a similar situation. We took on staff in January, we had to furlough all of them in March. And so we were in tandem of trying to save organisations from our sector, but also save ourselves, as I think was common at the time. We also established a series of national emergency conversations and did a whole raft of things alongside the research. Then move on just till June to September, we did other research. We were fortunate to be asked by Manchester to be involved in the GLA rapid review of COVID research. And we did a piece of research around BAME, we called BAME Stream, around mental health needs. And then we got involved in an equity funding group with London funders, amongst other things. We also, during that period, we actually developed the Clause Fund with Power to Change, because we became a strategic partner in February to Power to Change. So we were asked to be part of that. And so 60%, actually over 60%, about 66% of funding, that £9.5 million fund, went to BAME-led organisations across the country. And in tandem with BAME supported groups, it was over 80% of that 9.5 million that have gone into the sector, which is significant. And also in September last month, we for the first time attracted core funding, emergency core funding from the lottery. I am stressing the funding side because, of course, I'm talking to funders. And Kim said, I was also using community worker back in the day, Kim. So I know this opportunity doesn't come around very often. Just in terms of organisational lessons for Ubele, I mean, you know, we were able to do what many organisations did, which was to become, you know, was to flex, because we were a very emergent organisation. Up until last month, I'd spent 6 years working 2 days a week at Goldsmiths teaching community development and youth work students. So I had to, you know, we didn't have enough income to actually have full-time staff. So I just, 1st of October, I became full-time as a CEO. I am the founder as well. We also had to pay attention, and we're having to pay attention to our own internal organisational needs, because we didn't have the framework and the infrastructure, and so we're trying to do that. And also, we've been collaborating regionally, nationally, and locally with a whole raft of organisations. I'd just like to say a couple of things in terms of my personal reflections during this period and what's coming up. Despite the real flexibilities and innovations and the acknowledgement of institutional racism, again, echoing what Kim said, you know, that wasn't part of the agenda and the conversation 6 months ago, there's still a very real need to address that. There's a high level of organisations who've not had any funding under COVID, even though they've been established many, many years. There's also no clear strategy. We don't know which funders have supported BME funding specifically. Have they had funds? We don't know. We can't see the national picture about who's provided what specific funds here. I've been in conversation with Equally Ours and Future Foundation, see, can we do some quick and dirty mapping to see where there's been direct investment? I'm also increasingly hearing from BAME-led organisations. So we're flavour of the month now. How long is that going to last for? There's no clear strategy about whether this will lead to long-term systemic and transformational change for the sector as a whole, and for BME groups particularly. They are scared that this will all just fall off the ends after the 6 months emergency funding. And that really we need a clear message from funders about what's the intentions. Is this a long-term strategy, or is this just flavour of the month? And the last thing I'd say is that there is a real need for funders to shift from diversity to equity of outcomes. And we've been working with the London Community Response Fund on we've got some ideas, and we've had some ideas around that. Thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Yvonne, thank you very much indeed. Some really challenging comments there, particularly for funders on the call, and hopefully we'll get into some debate around those after we've heard from our final speaker. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to hand over to Moira Sinclair, who's Chief Executive of the Paul Hamlin Foundation. Been in that post since 2015, formerly with the Arts Council in England, and also Moira is chair of the Claw Leadership Group. So Moira, over to you for our final input. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. I'm going to try and not repeat everything everybody else has said, but it may be a little complicated. Let's see how we get on. Like many others, I think spring 2020 passed in this kind of whirlwind of decision making and Zoom meetings. We saw our entire operation move online, and it remains online. The office is broadly closed. And as Kim says, we saw this extraordinary community mobilization, a kind of explosion of music, of art, of poetry, of community engagement, phenomenal collaborations. Public services demonstrated their value and their ability to flex, I think, in a way I hadn't seen for many years. And there was this incredible acceleration in the use of digital technology. The air was cleaner, local was more valued. But COVID exposed existing inequalities in our society vividly and urgently, and it created new ones as well. And the world has been full of ambiguity and complexity, and we've certainly learned a huge amount about us as a funder and how we work, and also about the charitable and voluntary sector and the role that they play and what their needs are. And I think we've been trying very hard to pay attention to that. In terms of grant making in a crisis, I think the big thing was to recognise that the rainy day had arrived. And we made a recommendation to trustees that we needed to spend more, this was no time to hold back. Endowments were going all over the place, and I think there was some anxiety, but the investment team at PHF worked quickly and hard to ensure that we had cash at our disposal to make good on that recommendation, and our trustees agreed with us. So we were really early signatories to the funder pledge in March, and we announced our package of emergency support on the 6th of April. And I think that's a pretty quick turnaround, and it's something that we can reflect on. We made a commitment to be flexible with those who needed to repurpose their grants, and we created a £20 million emergency fund in addition to our usual grant making. So rather than seeing one replace the other, we intended to keep the budget on the table. We also changed our governance arrangements so that we could make grants more quickly. And in a significant team effort, we're not a big team, we spoke directly to the majority of our grantees, both in the UK and in India. We adjusted our existing grants, and to date we've committed just over £15 million in additional grants to over 250 organisations, partnerships and individuals. I'd be lying if I said that was easy. Just in terms of the number of transactions alone, it's placed a strain on our operating capacity. But it's been a real privilege to work alongside the team at PHF. And in turn, we've been motivated by the powerful stories we've been hearing and the work that we've been seeing across the UK and in India. So just a quick word about what those emergency grants have been enabling organisations to do. I think they've fallen into a few camps. One, it's enabled organisations we fund to respond to immediate needs from the communities they support. That's been particularly important for those organisations where vulnerabilities and inequality have been further exposed by the crisis. For example, those working with young people, with those who are already experiencing poverty, and with migrant and refugee communities. Whether through food parcels, providing tech to enable people to stay in touch because digital exclusion has been a huge issue, or maintaining advocacy for legal access and rights. These organisations have been extraordinary in reaching out and responding. And I should reflect that as a funder, we're not usually funding at that front line. We're usually funding the kind of systemic change work that sits behind it. So that's quite a shift for us. Many organisations have been increasingly impressive in adapting their services at pace to facilitate digital delivery. And that's required investment in laptops and phones and IT systems, while others have been developing and setting up new systems to allow them to meet demand. For others, particularly those, as Rosie said, who've been reliant on earned income, grants have helped to maintain cash flow and fund key salaries, allowing people to unfurlough their staff, which has been another really important issue. And then the process for making grants has been light touch and quick. It's been possible that we've been able to do that because we've chosen to respond in this phase to organisations with whom we have relationships and in sectors where we have expertise and good networks already in place. I think grant making is never an exact science, and it has not been easy at all to turn down very many worthwhile approaches from people who have been desperate. But given we are, even at our scale, a really small part of a much bigger funding ecology, I think it would have been irresponsible for us not to make choices. And we saw that a quick yes or a quick no was as beneficial to organisations who were also working at pace. They needed decisions made. And we've been busy establishing new partnerships and pooled funds, as well as being early contributors to the National Emergencies Trust and the local community response. We've made grants, for example, to the Community Justice Fund, which is helping specialist social welfare legal advice organisations cope, and also to the Educational Endowment Fund. Excuse me. The needs have been really diverse, but I think it's been abundantly clear that charities across the country need support more than they've ever done, particularly in order to support the communities in need. What have we learned? We can work at pace and we can be much more flexible. And this was really appreciated externally, but it does put a strain on our organisation, and we'll need to adapt if we think that that's becoming a more permanent way of working for us. We learned that a one-size-fits-all response was not what was needed. It was more tailored than we originally thought. And as the crisis enters a different phase, the same applies, I think. Some organisations are considering how they begin to return to work and mapping out what recovery means for them. For others, the true impact of the crisis is just beginning, and they face a much longer road ahead with months more of uncertainty. And as a recent IVAR report noted, we need to understand the importance of joined up thinking between emergency funding and other funding streams. And I think that's what Yvonne's talking about. The unforeseen consequence otherwise could be a really damaging hiatus just at the moment when clarity and steadfast from funders is needed most. We signed that pledge back in March, stating that we stand with the voluntary sector and we're listening. We need to really make sure we build on that, not just in the middle of the storm, but for the future. At PHF, we've been working on a refresh of our strategy before COVID, and we've been beefing up our commitment to social justice as part of that. But I think, if I'm honest, my assumption that because we were for equality and diversity, that was good enough, has been well and truly challenged through this crisis. We need to do much more to acknowledge and respond to the needs of communities, to diversity, equity and inclusion, and to race and power. Our programmatic focus won't change. If anything, the past 3 months have confirmed how much work there is to do. But the focus on tackling the root causes of inequalities and on using all of our resources to enable social change and developing deeper relationships with and responding to the needs of those we fund feels particularly pertinent now. And we've just refreshed the strategy and announced that. I think we can be sure that the demand for our funding will continue to grow. Rosie touched on local authorities and the strain that they're under. Those who have been reliant on income generation are really struggling. So I think trusts and foundations are going to be a port of call, even more so than they have been previously. But I think we need to make sure that the focus continues to be on making decisions, difficult decisions about who we do and do not fund, and to communicate that really clearly externally. At a macro level, we're seeing increased need on all fronts, but it's played out very differently across our different programmes. Our ability to intervene effectively will be determined by our awareness of the ecology of funding and where our investment sits, and an ability to be really clear with grantees about what we can and what we can't do. And I think one of the questions for us will be what happens in 2021 when most government and emergency support has run its course. The need for PHF to be there in rebuilding sector infrastructure and resilience and sustaining good new practice into the medium and long term feels really important to me. We've got to make sure we don't box off options in the autumn that would help us respond differently in the light of all of this. And we need to keep sight of that longer term game as well as the short term impact of COVID. Just a few personal reflections from me before we finish. I think the pursuit of perfection is not helpful in a crisis. We have needed to act, and I'm very proud of what we've achieved. But that does mean we have to be prepared to make mistakes and to correct as we go. This kind of iterative testing and adapting leadership requires confidence in strength in equal measures. That I found that for me as a chief exec, but I think the sector is also responding to that. And Rosie talked about that perspective from Akivo. I think we all need to build in pause points to inform decisions so adjustments can be made, and we need to think critically about what voices are feeding in to our work as funders so that we don't succumb to groupthink. I think ambiguity can feel really frustrating and even threatening for teams. So having a clear sense of purpose and communications about where we're heading, even acknowledging that the path may be bumpy, has been really important. I think my team have been challenged occasionally because we've had to make decisions at speed. And I think that can feel quite hierarchical, and we're not a hierarchical team by nature. And maintaining culture has been challenging, and it's becoming more challenging the longer we stay at home. So I take account of what Kim said about home working being really beneficial in many respects, but I think it's also creating mental health crises and real challenges for to keep that sort of cultural sense of who we are and how we work together, a collective purpose. I think it's really helpful to focus on purpose throughout the whole thing, and it's helped us guard against retreating. And for me, one of the biggest pieces has been about upping our internal and external communications from day one, to try and keep in touch with people, to try and be open and to continue to build trust in our teams. I think we don't have to be heroic. Exhausted bravery from CEOs is extremely anxiety inducing for everybody. So as a collective, I think we need to continue to think about how we support the sector and the leaders in the sector. We need them desperately to be functional and to be strong. And there's work to be done there too. John, I'll stop and we can talk about some of those things in more detail, I hope.
Fantastic, Maura. Thank you ever so much. And no repetition there, but some really clear themes and strands coming across through all 4 presentations, which I'm hoping we'll pick up more now in the Q&A. But thank you all very much for those inputs and contributions. I'm going to kick off with the question that's top of the list, and please look at the Q&A, people, and you can vote for questions that you want to see answered in this session by clicking on the like button next to the question. I'm going to ask the panelists, maybe kicking off with Yvonne, but the first question is an anonymous question, but I'm sure this has had several likes. In addition to the huge impact of COVID, what difference has Black Lives Matter made to your thinking and practice? And I'll just add to that a question from Neil Johnston, who has asked whether time has come to try and ring fence from a funder's perspective or an agreed percentage of collective funding for Black organisations. Okay. Yvonne, would you want to kick off with that?
Yeah, okay. In terms of the Black Lives Matters movement, I think one of the things that struck us in Ubele, we're an intergenerational organisation that was set up by a group of elders, because we're sort of 50 plus. And I think what's happened is when we've seen the numbers of young people globally come out and demonstrate against anti-racist practice, it's made us think more about how we kind of fast track the building of our organisation intergenerationally. So, I mean, the kind of, we've got sort of old, the older group of staff and volunteers and much younger group. And for us, there's something about the middle group, those who are sort of probably 30 to 45 and how we bring them into our organisation. So we're actively doing that at the moment through some of our projects. Just picking up on Moira's point about leadership. I mean, one of the things that we've seen is some awesome.
We lost you.
But it also made us realise through the younger generation coming through and demonstrating and demanding equity, we've realised that there's a bit of a missing story that we've also got to try and capture, and that's about Black and minority women activists in communities in the UK during the 60s to 80s, because a lot of the attention is being given to American struggle, and actually that story of our struggle in that era has not been documented. So we are going to look at doing that next year. In terms of funding, and there's a comment from Larisha about the possibility of setting up Black-led endowment. There are a number of conversations sort of just beginning to bubble with sort of different groups thinking about what a Black-led endowment or Black and minority ethnic endowment might look like. I think the time is right. There are some very small-scale initiatives at the moment that are community-led, which are around funding. Just had a proposal sent to me the other day, and I'm involved in a collective saving group that's community-based that gives funding to small projects in communities. And we've been talking about this for a number of years, the need for us to have our own money that we're in charge of. However, and I do put a big however, I would not want charities and foundations, even if they supported such an initiative, to say we've done the Black thing, it's over there, and not actually, and use it as an opportunity to kind of, to not take, not have responsibility to actually transform their their main funding, and for, and to feel that they've actually been let off the hook. So I think it's and rather than or, and very much the and. And I think the timing for that kind of conversation is now. We're certainly in conversation around Phoenix 2.0. And we, talking about a strategy for partly funded by the lottery, but actually potentially match funded by a range of other funders. And that's a conversation we just started last week. Yeah.
Thanks, Yvonne. Maura, from a funder's perspective, can I maybe bring you in on this particular question? Thanks.
Yeah, I think I touched on it, but I think it's making a big difference, both internally in terms of our conversations and in terms of our thinking about funding. We had a commitment to social justice in our strategy going back a long way. Our founder, Paul Hamlin, was a refugee, a Jewish refugee who came from Germany at the prior to the beginning of the Second World War, and established the foundation on the back of his astonishing success as a businessman. So that commitment to social justice had always been there, but actually it wasn't enough. And I think we had started to do that work before COVID, but my goodness, COVID really accelerated it. And then the Black Lives Matter movement and demonstrations pointedly asked questions of us as a funder and of me as a chief executive of a funding organisation. We're members of the DEI Funder Coalition. So again, we had started to do some work to unpack across all of our aspects of funding what we were doing. And there's some really clear things that emerged. I can't remember which one of the panelists mentioned it, but we don't have the data at the moment to tell you whether we fund Black-led organisations or not, or disabled-led organisations or not, or organisations by women. There's a really good reason why we haven't collected that data, which is to do with us not wanting to overburden people who are applying to us in terms of filling in forms, and we've always tried to keep relatively light touch, but actually that's now come back to bite us because we're just not cited, and we're not cited on unconscious bias that may be in place because of that as well. So there are some very key things that we need to do quite quickly now, and we are part of the Funders for Race Equalities group who have been doing work around trialling different methods of collecting data, and that's a commitment that we're going to make as we reopen our core grant making from October onwards. Representation is another huge issue in terms of funders and fund making, and Charity So White pointed to that, as well as to representation in the sector. So again, we took a DEI statement and action plan to our board in I think all of 3 weeks ago, and as part of that we're committed to publishing our own stats around representation, both at staff level and at trustee level, and in terms of our decision making panels as well, and to taking steps to improve representation where that needs to happen. So I think it's been a real moment of change, and I am extremely grateful to our Black staff at PHF who have generously provided challenge, knowing that the emotional loading on them has been hard in all sorts of other respects of their lives as well. So it's been, again, a complete team effort to get us shifted from the position that we've previously taken.
Thanks, Maura. I'm going to come to the other two panelists with another question, if that's okay. Question from Sarah Ridley at the London Marathon Charitable Trust. What are the biggest barriers that each of you face in delivering your objectives? And how would it be most helpful for funders to respond in the short and longer term? Rosie, do you want to maybe pick that one up?
Yeah, thanks. That is a big question, but I'll try and. So I think this last 3 weeks have been the hardest 3 weeks on the last 8 months for our organisation, and I think this is just the beginning of the difficulty. We now look back at lockdown as the kind of glory days when we were doing quizzes on Zoom and everyone was kind of and now we have much higher need and much less resources, both money, and we don't know when it's going to end. And the planning, we did what we thought was really harsh contingency planning at the time. We thought that, and our kind of situation is, well, it's at the moment on track with our projections, but they were pretty bad projections. And I think we all thought when we did them, it was a worst case scenario. And so I think there's something about actually, how do we really think about what's needed for this next year, I think, actually, and kind of shift that, because the emergency response in terms of how do we get people through this next 6 months, 6 months ago was brilliant, but actually now everybody's exhausted and there's another year of it probably. And I think that's where the mindset needs to shift in terms of the way we plan, the way we operate, the way we think, In terms of what that means for funders, I think now starting to shift away from that short-term mentality, which I know all of you are already doing, but in terms of that, actually, what support can we offer for the next 2 to 3 years as people ride out this next period? But then, you know, many charities will be coming out of this with no reserves. And how do we then start to, how do we rebuild on the other side of this? And how do we give people the confidence that it's worth getting through this next 6 to 9 months, because there will be something better on the other side.
Thank you, Rosie. Kim, from a local authority perspective, can I bring you in here about how funders and local authorities could be working more collaboratively on some of these challenges we're facing?
I think it starts with money. I think it starts with the best part of £40 million has been given out by the London Funders Group. I think that's so powerful. So I think that you're already doing that as funders, because local government, as you all know, have not received the funding that we thought we were going to get from government on COVID, but that's another story. I think it comes back to what Yvonne was saying about starting with communities and asking what the needs are. So in my borough, 4,000 people volunteered during the early days of COVID. That legacy of community participation and volunteering, what do we think about that? It's not always about how do we fund it, it's how do we harness it, how do we support it? So I think we've got to do more community conversations to talk to people about what do they need, and better Wi-Fi or tech or meeting spaces, rather than always establishing organisations. That seems to be our default sometimes. So I think there's a lot of learning there. In terms of local authorities, what's the big pressures for me? Test and trace. Test and trace, and our inability to contact communities in the way that we need to get everybody to consider this to still be a serious matter. So it's about the role of communities and funders in community nudge, behaviour nudge, targeted messages. How can we make sure that the disproportionate impacts around COVID, people are understanding that they still need to take it seriously? So I think that we're in for a tough few months with London at tier 2, trying to manage the community, residents, their views on face covering and the threat of COVID going forward.
Thanks very much, Kim. I'm going to take another question and maybe try and combine a couple here. This is about thinking into the future, but learning from what we've learned in the last 6 months. How can funders begin to start planning for the future and longer term funding, particularly taking the sector with them? So in a sort of collaborative co-design way. Who would like to have a stab at that one? Should we come back to you, Yvonne?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, it's just really, I think, partly picking up on what I was saying earlier about, you know, the feedback that we're getting from Black and minority ethnic groups nationally, because we've pulled together, we're convening the Phoenix Fund, we're working with Global Fund for Children, which has been really refreshing because they're, you know, not really known in the UK, so they have participatory grant making, but they've actually been infinitely flexible. They're aware that they're there to do the heavy lifting and so on. But actually, it's you know, for us and what we're hearing about, you know, is this, how temporary is this kind of shift in focus, and that acknowledgement that there's a real need to support Black and minority ethnic communities longer term. So I think that there, you know, I suppose putting out a plea really for funders to actually, you know, convene some conversations with Black and minority ethnic funders. Don't just invite us as 1 or 2 tokens to wider meetings. Let's have some kind of hard talking, but also let's say what's worked. Because actually for the, you know, groups that are getting funded, although there are a number of groups, said a lot that haven't, but it is beginning to make a difference. So I think there's an opportunity for funders to start saying, well, let's get into conversation and let's do it in a group, you know, round table discussion, and let's kind of deal with the past, but actually really start, you know, thinking strategically about the future. Maybe bring to the table some of the data of what has happened across London in terms of funders providing specific funds for Black and minority ethnic communities as well. Let's kind of look at what's happened. But I think there's a really urgent space for conversation, because confidence was really low in terms of funding, the funding relationship. Trust was the big elephant in the room, I think lack of it. And I know that BME Group said, you know, funders do not trust us with the money. And it feels they're beginning to break that down, chipping away at it slowly over the past few months. So let's make another step forward, I think, in, you know, and to build on what we've done, to help shape the strategy over the next 2 or 3 or 5 years. And the second thing is core funding. You know, I didn't, you know, core funding, it's been a kind of bane of our lives because of the project-based work that most organisations had to do. You know, Ubele, we've not had reserves ever. We've not had reserves, so we've been going 6 years. We don't have reserves. We might have a little bit of reserves at the end of this next year, but we've not got any reserves. So, and if we're being used as a sort of national exemplar, then it sort of speaks volumes really to the state of the sector prior to COVID. So that's what I'd like to add in relation to that.
Thanks, Yvonne. Moira, did you want to come in on the funding issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think flexible, unrestricted funding is the kind of goal for everybody. And, you know, I could hear virtual cheers with people going, yes, just let us get on with it. We know what we're doing. And I think we will do more of that, in that we've already do some, but I think we are committed to doing more of that. And I think there's something quite interesting about the mix between short-term funding and longer funding as well. I don't think all organisations are going to be in a position to actually want a commitment of very long-term funding initially, because I think they're changing their models. What I think they want is a short-term contribution and the possibility to come back to us quite quickly without having to go through a whole application process over and over again. I think quick no's are going to be really important in all of this, rather than making people go through enormous application forms and then finding a no at the end, particularly if we're refocusing some of our efforts on those smaller organisations because they don't have the capacity to be writing hundreds of applications. I think Yvonne's point is well made, and we're already convening some of those conversations, but both at programmatic level and across funder level. And London funders have played a really important role in helping us do that. And relationships matter, you know, spending time on the conversation about what the sector needs from us rather than making a set of assumptions is important. The last thing I'd say is that we reopened to normal grant making at the end of this month, and we are making a specific signal change there to address need in a different way, and that means that some will benefit from that and some won't. And so again, there's a series of quite complicated conversations with our existing grantees to say that not all of them will be in future portfolios if we're to make room for others to be part of that. So that shift in power and money is not an easy one for funders to navigate, and for grants managers in particular.
Thanks, Maura. Can I just bring in Rosie on this one? We heard a couple of times during the presentations about the importance of infrastructure. I mean, we've talked about core funding. Infrastructure is obviously something also I think we've learning from the past. If you don't invest in infrastructure, it comes back and bites you when you face a situation like we're in now. Rosie, do you want to just comment on that in the context of funding priorities going forward?
Yeah, and I think from an Akivo perspective, the infrastructure organisations came together really quickly at the beginning, initially out of a desire to try and get support money out of government, which was successful to an extent, but not to the extent that we would have liked. Those collaborations have continued, and I think the infrastructure sector is well aware that there's a need to be, you know, I've now started convening a group of chairs of infrastructure organisations. So we've had a couple of meetings, firstly looking at race equity and how do we embed that in governance across the sector, because that's very much something that we feel we need to be. Often there can be a desire to do something at a chief exec and staff level, but if that's not really supported at a governance level, it can be tokenistic. But that collaboration is also looking at what does the sector need from infrastructure over the next 2 to 3 years, and how do we make sure that we're as efficient and kind of focused and clear about what we all contribute and how that complements each other as possible, and at the same time not draining resources that could be spent on frontline work.
Thank you. I think I've got time for one final question. I'm going to come to all 4 of you on this one. It's a question that's been posed in the Q&A. And again, it's thinking about the recent past. Is there anything that you wish you had done differently? Thinking about the last 6 months, is there anything you regret having done, or think something you'd have done differently? Going back to that comment I made about at the beginning about things we can reject, things we want to retain, and things we want to restore. Anything you like to comment on that from the recent past? Kim, do you want to come in on this one?
I think it's a tough one, and I say no regrets. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, John?
Yeah, go for it, Kim.
I think I've frozen. I say no regrets. We've done the best that we can with the resources, with the capacity, with the capability. I think that London should pat itself on its back, actually, because our resilience has been tested. There's always lessons. We use those to future-proof what we do next, as opposed to look back. No, I absolutely say no. We've done the best job that we could under those circumstances. And no, there's nothing that I would do differently. On a personal level, I probably would have learnt that overeating and alcohol and staying at home, but that's another conversation for another time.
Yeah, join the club. Okay, Yvonne, how about you?
Yeah, I had to think hard on that, because when you've been so busy responding, you know, it's like, I think there's something about our staff team that probably would have done differently, because we started off, you know, we had 1 full-time staff last year, December, 3.5 in January. I think that I would have, one of our directors is brilliant with people, actually, he's absolutely brilliant. But I think as a CEO, I would have probably spent more time just ensuring our staff were being properly looked after by me, not by the organisation, by me, because, you know, as I increasingly got pulled and pushed and cajoled into all sorts of different places and spaces that we'd never been in before, I was kind of out behind in Zoom. I was out there, like I'm out there today, talking to policymakers, planners, funders, and so on and so forth. So I think I would have checked in more with our staff team, and you know, just to check in that they're okay. Really, I think, you know, I'm a very task orientated, busy bee, and I think that was something that I would do differently. But in terms of the activities and the ways that we responded to the community and to the sector, probably not many things that I would have done differently. But staffing, yes, that's me personally. It's not no reflection on the people that I work with, but that's just about me. Yeah.
Thanks, Yvonne. Rosie.
I've got two. The first very quick one is we would have got laptops to people quicker. We're now doing a kind of give us laptops appeal to get to people, but actually nationally, everybody should have just had a laptop. And I think that needs to be seen as a basic human right if this is the way that we're going to live. Secondly, I think for us, and this might be interesting for others, so when we were working at home and we were in proper lockdown, it was very much, we did a lot around wellbeing. We had an 11 o'clock meeting every day. It was very much a priority. And then when we moved back into the house, we put all of the COVID secure stuff in place. So we were kind of like, we're safe now, everyone can just come back and things will be normal. And we didn't have the same level of kind of well-being infrastructure and check-ins as we'd had in place when people are at home. And actually what we realized was that it's not that we were at home and now we're back to normal. We're now in this strange world where we're face-to-face in COVID, and that is actually, there's a lot of stresses that come with being in that world. And so thinking about that intermediary culture between being at home and then actually being in the workplace in COVID is not the same, and you need a whole new set of systems and norms to be established to support people through that.
Thank you. And Moira.
I think 3 things for me. One is that when the Black Lives Matter demonstrations happened, I wish I personally, had reacted more swiftly and surely, particularly in conversations with my staff, than I did. I think home working has been extremely tough, especially for women, because of the emotional load they carry as primary carers as well as professionals. And we put a lot of things in place, but I think as grant makers, the lack of boundaries between work and home was really quite problematic, especially when you're hearing difficult stories and you're having to say no a lot. And I wish I'd understood a bit more how that was having an impact on some of our younger members of staff in particular. And then on a purely technical level, we have delegated authority to make under 20k grants. So we made an enormous amount of under 20k grants, and that put this a huge strain on the organisation. And I wish I'd paused and just thought about the number of transactions we were going to have to deal with if we did £20,000 grants and maybe went back to trustees and had a conversation about how we could do that differently, because in effect people have come back to us more than once on some occasions, and we could have just made a bigger grant at the beginning of the process and saved ourselves a bit of time, as well as the organisations we were talking to.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Jane, I'm just conscious that we're coming up to 11:20 and need to wrap up. We've got the results of another, I think we're doing another poll to share with you as well. But I'd just like to thank all the speakers this morning. The thing it's brought home to me is just how collaborative and willing to share experience everyone has been over the past 6 months, and that has been brought out in abundance this morning in the chat and in the presentations. And people have mentioned the R word a few times. The resilience of the sector has come through time and again over the past 6 months, but I think there have also been some salutary messages and warning shots from people like Rosie and others this morning about how we can learn lessons from the first lockdown if we go into another similar period as we head into the winter. There are lessons we can learn from that around not retreating but sharing and retaining this approach to collaboration and partnership working. I'd like to thank you all very much for your contributions this morning. There have been a few other questions on the chat which we haven't been able to get around to, but I'm sure we'll try and answer those in due course, particularly around some of the data and the funding of Black organisations. And I know that the London Community Response has been doing some excellent work through DataKind on monitoring where that funding has been going, and we can share that with participants in due course. But before I just hand over to James, again, thank you to all our speakers, to Rosie, to Moira, to Kim and to Yvonne, and thank you all for being such great participants this morning. I'm going to hand back to James at London Funders.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. And thank you also to Rosie, Yvonne, Moira and Kim for being a fantastic panellist and getting our conference off to a great start this morning. Some hugely important insights there from across sectors that I think will help frame our understanding of what we need to capture from the last 6 months and think about now for the future, both as we head into a second wave of COVID-19, as we head into a fourth wave of the London Community Response, and also as we head into the next days of our conference. To round things off today, we'd like to ask 2 more questions to you in a poll, which I'm going to launch and you'll be able to see on your screens now. There are 2 questions we want to ask. The first is a practical one. What are you going to do as a result of today's discussions? As you know, at London Funders, we're really committed to trying to make sure that we don't just talk about things, but we also act on them. So we're asking you to think about what are you going to do as a result of what you've heard today from our fantastic panel, whether you're going to share that with your team, whether you're going to think a bit more once you've joined our other conference sessions, whether you've already got ideas about how you're going to act to make changes to your plans for the future. And our second question is a supportive one from us at the London Funders team. What can we do to support you in those decisions that you're going to take? We've got opportunities to involve you in the learning partner work that we're doing as part of the London Community Response that colleagues have spoken about on the panel. We could set up some networking groups to help you focus in on some of these issues in a bit more detail. We can also continue some of the work that we already do in terms of research and informing your thinking. And we can also look at how we can contribute some of that both to policy discussions at a local, regional and national level, and how we can bring some of those policy thoughts back to you to enable you to do your work more effectively. So we're really keen to hear from you over the next 30 seconds or so about what you're going to do as a result of today's discussions, and then what you'd like from us to support you. While you're voting on that, I'll remind you that we do have more sessions coming up over the next couple of days. You'll find information and thought pieces about all of those in the conference magazine that you've been sent in advance, and we'd encourage you to send the Eventbrite link to your colleagues if they might like to join us over the next 2 days as well. Tomorrow we'll be looking at the now and what's coming up over the next 6 months, where you'll hear from colleagues from Citybridge Trust, the Resolution Foundation, Charity Comms, Toynbee Hall and Inclusion London. On Thursday, we'll be looking ahead to the future beyond the crisis, thinking about what kind of London we want to have for our communities for the long term. You'll hear there from colleagues such as the Deputy Mayor for Social Integration, Social Mobility and Community Engagement, Centre for London, the New Economics Foundation, and the National Lottery Community Fund, chaired by London councils. So a great couple of days coming up. We're going to end the polling for this one to think about how you're going to deal with the issues that we've talked about today. Great to hear that the biggest result there is that you're going to reflect. So you're going to be joining us for the next couple of days over the conference to think about how we take these decisions in the round, and also really positive that you're going to take that learning back to your team. For us, the third of you that are already thinking about the changes that you want to make, we're here to help support you on that journey. And on that support, it's good to see there a mix of things that you're looking for from us. We're going to take all that on board. Really importantly for London Funders, we're also coming up with what our strategy is going to be for the future, how we build on the work that we've done through the crisis, such as the London Community Response, to support the funding community for the future. So this input is really helpful both in terms of how we take these immediate discussions forward, but also how we as a network support you for the long term. So thank you hugely for completing that poll. You can see the results there on your screens now. So just a final thank you from me to all of you for joining us today for the discussion, to our fantastic panel for being so generous with their time and their thoughts this morning. Do keep the conversation going on the hashtag Conference20 online. We're going to be posting some more content this afternoon, and you'll also see that conversation continuing over the next couple of days through our future sessions. So for now, thank you to our panel. Thank you to all of you for engaging in the conversation this morning. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you at the sessions tomorrow. Bye for now.